This is part 3 of chapter 9, Man and His Doubles, and it's called the Analytic of Finitude. By the way, it's a phrase borrowed from Heidegger. And This is Foucault's book, The Order of Things. When natural history becomes biology, when the analysis of wealth becomes economics, when, above all, reflection upon language becomes philology, in classical discourse in which being and representation found their common locus is eclipsed, then, in the profound upheaval of such an archaeological mutation, man appears in his ambiguous position as an object of knowledge and as a subject that knows. Enslaved sovereign, observed spectator, he appears in the place belonging to the king, which was assigned to him in advance by Las Meninas, but from which his real presence has for so long been excluded. As if in that vacant space towards which Velasquez's whole painting was directed, but which it was nevertheless reflecting only in the chance presence of a mirror, and as though by stealth all the figures whose alternation, reciprocal exclusion, interweaving, and fluttering, when imagined, the model, the painter, the king, the spectator, suddenly stopped their imperceptible dance, immobilized into one substantial figure, and demanded that the entire space of the representation should at last be related to one corporeal gaze. The motive of this new presence, the modality proper to it, the particular arrangement of the episteme that justifies it, the new relation that is established by means of it, between words, things, and their order, all this can now be clarified. Cuvier and his contemporaries had required of life that it should itself define, in the depths of its being, the conditions of possibility of the living being. In the same way, Ricardo had required labor to provide the conditions of possibility of exchange, profit, and production. The first philologists, too, had searched in the historical depths of languages for the possibility of discourse and of grammar. This meant that representation ceased, ipso facto, to have validity as the locus of origin of living beings' needs and words, or as the primitive seat of their truth. Henceforth, it is nothing more in relation to them than an effect, their more or less blurred counterpart in a consciousness which apprehends and reconstitutes them. The representation one makes to oneself of things no longer has to deploy in a sovereign space the table into which they have been ordered. It is for that empirical individual who is man the phenomenon, perhaps even less the appearance, of an order that now belongs to things themselves and to their interior law. It is no longer their identity that beings manifest in representation, but the external relation they establish with the human being. The latter, with his own being, with his power to present himself with representations, arises in a space hollowed out by living beings, objects of exchange, and words. When abandoning representation, which had been their natural site hitherto, they withdraw into the depths of things and roll up upon themselves in accordance with the laws of life, production, and language. In the middle of them all, compressed within the circle they form, man is designated, more required, by them, since it is he who speaks, since he is seen to reside among the animals, and in a position that is not merely privileged, but a source of order for the totality they form. Even though he is not conceived as the end product of evolution, he is recognized to be one extremity of a long series. And since, lastly, the relation between his needs and the means he possesses to satisfy them is such that he is necessarily the principle and means of all production. But this imperious designation is ambiguous. In one sense, man is governed by labor, life and language. His concrete existence finds its determinations in them. It is possible to have access to him only through his words, his organism, the objects he makes, as though it is they who possess the truth in the first place, and they alone, perhaps. And he, as soon as he thinks, merely unveils himself to his own eyes in the form of a being who is already in a necessarily subjacent density, in an irreducible interiority, a living being, an instrument of production, a vehicle for words which exist before him. All these contents that his knowledge reveals to him as exterior to himself and older than his own birth anticipate him, overhang him with all their solidity, and traverse him as though he were merely an object of nature, a face doomed to be erased in the course of history. Man's finitude is heralded, and imperiously so, in the positivity of knowledge. We know that man is finite, as we know the anatomy of the brain, the mechanics of production costs, or the system of Indo-European conjugation. Or rather, like a watermark running through all these solid, positive, and full forms, we perceive the finitude and limits they impose. We sense, as though on their blank reverse sides, all that they make impossible. But this primary discovery of finitude is really an unstable one. Nothing allows it to contemplate itself. And would it not be possible to suppose that it also promises that very infinity it refuses, according to the system of actuality? The evolution of the species has perhaps not reached its culmination. Forms of production and labor are still being modified, and perhaps one day man will no longer find the principle of his alienation in his labor, or the constant reminder of his limitations and his needs, nor is there any proof that he will not discover symbolic systems sufficiently pure to dissolve the ancient opacity of historical languages. Heralded in positivity, man's finitude is outlined in the paradoxical form of the endless. Rather than the rigor of a limitation, it indicates the monotony of a journey which, though it probably has no end, is nevertheless perhaps not without hope. And yet all these contents, with what they conceal and what they also leave pointing towards the frontiers of time, have positivity within the space of knowledge and approach the task of a possible acquisition of knowledge only because they are thoroughly imbued with finitude. For they would not be there in the light that partly illumines them if man, who discovers himself through them, was trapped in the mute, nocturnal, immediate, and happy opening of animal life. But nor would they posit themselves in the acute angle that hides them from their own direction, if man could traverse them without residuum in the lightning flash of an infinite understanding. But to man's experience, a body has been given, a body which is his body, a fragment of ambiguous space, whose peculiar and irreducible spatiality is nevertheless articulated upon the space of things. To this same experience, desire is given as a primordial appetite on the basis of which all things assume value and relative value. To this same experience, a language is given in the thread of which all the discourses of all times, all successions, and all simultaneities may be given. This is to say that each of these positive forms in which man can learn that he is finite is given to him only against the background of its own finitude. Moreover, the latter is not the most completely purified essence of positivity, but that upon the basis of which it is possible for positivity to arise. The mode of being of life, and even that which determines the fact that life cannot exist without prescribing its forms for me, are given to me fundamentally by my body. The mode of being of production, the weight of its determinations upon my existence, are given to me by my desire. And the mode of being of language, the whole backwash of history to which words lend their glow at the instant they are pronounced, and perhaps even in a time more imperceptible still, are given to me only along the slender chain of my speaking thought. At the foundation of all the empirical positivities and of everything that can indicate itself as a concrete limitation of man's existence, we discover a finitude, which is in a sense the same. It is marked by the spatiality of the body, the yawning of desire, and the time of language. And yet it is radically other. In this sense, the limitation is expressed not as a determination imposed upon man from outside because he has a nature or a history, but as a fundamental finitude, which rests on nothing but its own existence as fact, and opens upon the positivity of all concrete limitation. Thus, in the very heart of empiricity, there is indicated the obligation to work backwards or downwards to an analytic of finitude, in which man's being will be able to provide a foundation in their own positivity for all those forms that indicate to him that he is not infinite. And the first characteristic with which this analytic will mark man's mode of being, or rather the space in which that mode of being will be deployed in its entirety, will be that of repetition, of the identity and the difference between the positive and the fundamental. The death that anonymously gnaws at the daily existence of the living being is the same as that fundamental death on the basis of which my empirical life is given to me. The desire that links and separates men in the neutrality of the economic process is the same as that on the basis of which everything is desirable for me. The time that bears languages along upon it, that takes up its place within them and finally wears them out, is the same time that draws my discourse out, even before I have pronounced it, into a succession that no man can master. From one end of experience to the other, finitude answers itself. It is the identity and the difference of the positivities and of their foundation within the figure of the same. It is apparent how modern reflection, as soon as the first shoot of this analytic appears, bypasses the display of representation, together with its culmination in the form of a table as ordered by classical knowledge, and moves towards a certain thought of the same, in which difference is the same thing as identity. It is within this vast but narrow space opened up by the repetition of the positive within the fundamental, that the whole of this analytic of finitude, so closely linked to the future of modern thought, will be deployed. It is there that we shall see in succession the transcendental repeat the empirical, the cogito repeat the unthought, the return of the origin repeat its retreat. It is there, from itself as starting point, that a thought of the same irreducible to classical philosophy is about to affirm itself. It may perhaps be remarked that there was no need to wait until the 19th century for the idea of finitude to be revealed. It is true that the 19th century perhaps only displaced it within the space of thought, making it play a more complex, more ambiguous, less easily bypassed role. For 17th and 18th century thought, it was his finitude that forced man to live an animal existence, to work by the sweat of his brow, to think with opaque words. It was this same finitude that prevented him from attaining any absolute knowledge of the mechanisms of his body, the means of satisfying his needs, the method of thinking without the perilous aid of a language woven wholly of habits and imagination. As an inadequation extending to infinity, man's limitation accounted both for the existence of the empirical contents and for the impossibility of knowing them immediately. And thus the negative relation to infinity, whether conceived of as creation or fall or conjunction of body and soul or determination within the infinite being, or individual point of view of the totality, or link between representation and impression, was posited as anterior to man's empiricity and to the knowledge he may gain of it. In a single movement, but without reciprocal return or circularity, it provided the foundation for the existence of bodies, needs, and words, and for the impossibility of subjugating them within an absolute knowledge. The experience taking form at the beginning of the 19th century situates the discovery of finitude not within the thought of the infinite, but at the very heart of those contents that are given by a finite act of knowing as the concrete forms of finite existence. Hence the interminable to and fro of a double system of reference. If man's knowledge is finite, it is because he is trapped, without possibility of liberation, within the positive contents of language, labor, and life. And inversely, if life, labor, and language may be posited in their positivity, it is because knowledge has finite forms. For classical thought, in other words, finitude, as a determination positively constituted on the basis of the infinite, provides an account of those negative forms, which are body, needs, language, and the limited knowledge it is possible to have of them. For modern thought, the positivity of life, of production and labor, which have their own existence, historicity, and laws, provides a foundation for the limited character of knowledge as their negative correlation. And inversely, the limits of knowledge provide a positive foundation for the possibility of knowing, though in an experience that is always limited, what life, labor, and language are. As long as these empirical contents were situated within the space of representation, a metaphysics of the infinite was not only possible, but necessary. It was necessary, in fact, that they should be the manifest forms of human finitude, and yet that they should be able to have their locus and their truth within representation. The idea of infinity and the idea of its determination in finitude made one another possible. But when these empirical contents were detached from representation and contained the principle of their existence within themselves, then the metaphysics of infinity became useless. From that point on, finitude never ceased to refer back to itself, from the positivity of the contents to the limitations of knowledge, and from the limited positivity of knowledge to the limited knowledge of the contents. Whereupon the entire field of Western thought was inverted. Where there had formerly been a correlation between a metaphysics of representation and of the infinite, and an analysis of living beings, of man's desires, and of the words of his language, we find being constituted an analytic of finitude and human existence. And in opposition to it, though in correlative opposition, a perpetual tendency to constitute a metaphysics of life, labor, and language. But these are never anything more than tendencies, immediately opposed and, as it were, undermined from within, for there can be no question of anything but metaphysics reduced to the scale of human finitudes. The metaphysic of a life that converges upon man, even if it does not stop with him, the metaphysic of a labor that frees man so that man, in turn, can free himself from it, the metaphysics of a language that man can reappropriate in the consciousness of his own culture. Modern thought, then, will contest even its own metaphysical impulses and show that reflections upon life, labor, and language, insofar as they have value as analytics of finitude, express the end of metaphysics. The philosophy of life denounces metaphysics as a veil of illusion, That of labor denounces it as an alienated form of thought and an ideology. That of language as a cultural episode. But the end of metaphysics is only the negative side of a much more complex event in Western thought. This event is the appearance of man. However, it must not be supposed that he suddenly appeared upon our horizon imposing the brutal fact of his body, his labor, and his language in a manner so eruptive as to be absolutely baffling to our own reflection. It is not man's lack of positivity that reduced the space of metaphysics so violently. No doubt, on the level of appearances, modernity begins when the human being begins to exist within his organism, inside the shell of his head, inside the armature of his limbs, and in the whole structure of his physiology, when he begins to exist at the center of a labor by whose principles he is governed and whose product eludes him, when he lodges his thought in the folds of a language so much older than himself that he cannot master its significations, even though they have been called back to life by the insistence of his words. But more fundamentally, our culture crossed the threshold beyond which we recognize our modernity when finitude was conceived in an interminable cross-reference with itself. Though it is true, at the level of the various branches of knowledge, that finitude is always designated on the basis of man as a concrete being and on the basis of the empirical forms that can be assigned to his existence. Nevertheless, at the archaeological level, which reveals the general, historical a priori of each of those branches of knowledge, modern man, that man assignable in his corporal, laboring, and speaking existence, is possible only as a figuration of finitude. Modern culture can conceive of man because it conceives of the finite on the basis of itself. Given these conditions, it is understandable that classical thought, in all the forms of thought that preceded it, were able to speak of the mind and the body, of the human being, of how restricted a place he occupies in the universe, of all the limitations by which his knowledge or his freedom must be measured, but that not one of them was ever able to know man as he is posited in modern knowledge. Renaissance humanism and classical rationalism were indeed able to allot human beings a privileged position in the order of the world, but they were not able to conceive of man.